Every year, Hamilton Native Outpost has a field day to share knowledge of native plants. Loren and Steele discussed how a diversity of plants impacts livestock health as well as meat and milk quality, and how livestock culture plays into their diet. Loren, with Living Lands, manages cattle and goats for brush control. In the video description, check out other videos from the field day. We now join the field day as Loren is introducing his topic.
I've been wondering what I was going to say. I guess we're going to find out now. So I think they told me I was supposed to talk about why diversity is good for the livestock. And I got just a handful of notes to maybe keep me on track. We'll see if it works. So one thing I want to start with, Justin's been talking a lot about our natural systems. And I think as our farmers and ranchers here, that we can learn a lot from those natural systems. And if we try to model things off of what nature has put in place, that's a great starting place for sure. And if you look at nature, you almost never see monocultures of stuff. And if you do, it's probably in a very localized area. It's not going to be acres and acres. So with that in mind, I think it's a good example to use and follow and put some diversity out there on the landscape. I even just used it to think about yourself a little bit. So we're talking, a lot about grazing these and as forages, these plants. So what do you eat yourself? Do you just eat one thing? You just have Cheerios every day, all day long? Even if you want to move up to something that we usually think is pretty good, if we don't have ribeye, if that's the only thing you got, probably get tired of it. I get to experience a little bit myself. My wife is a great cook, so I hope she doesn't take this the wrong way. She's probably around here listening somewhere. And my grandma's a pretty, or not grandma, mother-in-law. My mother-in-law's a pretty good cook.
Just keep on moving down the hill.
It's sunny out there, but it might be worth it. And so we stay a little busier than we ought to, maybe. We got 3 young kids, and sometimes she makes a big old batch of something that lasts for most of the week. She must have got those pans from some kind of restaurant outfit or something, because boy, they're big. But after about 3 or 4 days of eating the same chili batch, you don't need as much of it. So that's one of the things that I think we get when we put all these different species out here, is they'll just eat more. You get a higher intake. You get more out there, more different varieties. Those cattle, goats, sheep, whatever you got, they'll eat more. So there's one advantage right there. If they're eating more, they're bound to produce a little more. We see that in people who eat a whole lot. A lot of times, there's an efficiency difference. Sometimes I can eat quite a bit. I still haven't got too big, but my time's maybe coming. Colt over there, I'm not sure it's working as good for him. He's been having to work harder, eating less, I think. So he's going to talk to you next. Well, hard telling what he'll have to say after that
You're wormy.
He says I'm wormy. That could be. So I've been kind of listening to some stuff from Fred Provenza, and he's from Utah State, and I think he's retired or semi-retired. Not sure he ever quite quits. He's always studying something. I've had the privilege of meeting Fred, and he's a pretty well-read individual, but very humble. And he's spent 45 years studying animal behavior and nutrition, and he's gotten into the human side of that quite a bit. And so he's finding that you got all these plants out here, and they've got these secondary compounds in them. And a lot of those are, tannins, alkaloids, terpenes. Some of those are you think of as bad, but maybe not in the right quantity. A little bit of some things is fine, and especially mixed with other things, they actually work together in symbiotic relationships. And some of the things that he's seen with that, and he's a co-publisher of a book, which I think he just did more of the translating part of it than he did the actual writing of that particular book. But Michel Murray, I think, from France, was the original main writer of this book, and he had spent his life studying the shepherds over in France. And those shepherds have spent so much time observing those sheep. When they go up into those high mountain meadows, and they're grazing sheep with no fence. They're just moving them around. And we don't do a whole lot of that in most parts of the world anymore, but there's still an intact part of that happening there. And some of those shepherds have learned so much from watching those sheep that they understand that they can set up a whole meal plan for those sheep. When they start the day out, they've got a plan. Well, I'm going to take them over here for a little while. When they first get out, they're good and hungry. They're going to eat anything. So we can take them to this little bit lower quality forage, per se. And I'm probably not going to do near as good a job as this guy would if he was here to tell you. And then after they're about to kind of fill up on that a little bit, well, we'll go over here and we'll give them some of that, and it'll work kind of as a booster. And through this, they have learned that, you know, even the nuances of if they eat a little bit of this first, they'll eat more of that one. And so you've got these different landscape positions, and you've got different plant communities in those. And they've learned to work through those to get better and better performance out of those sheep by what they're eating. And it's essentially just setting up a meal plan. And they know at about what time of day that those sheep are going to be full and they're going to need to lay down and ruminate for a while. And so they'll have that in the plan, and what time they're going to go to water and all those things. And I think that's pretty neat. And we don't have that intact culture here in this area to do things like that, but we can still use that information to some degree to understand that all this variety out here is important and very beneficial to our livestock. They can even self-medicate themselves to some degree. And the people, Glenn Elzinga out in Idaho, and he's doing something similar. He's got herders with about a 450 head herd of cattle that they run over a 70 square mile piece of national forest allotment in northern Idaho, or north central Idaho. And it's a pretty diverse region there as well. And so they have learned as they've went along. He didn't always have that allotment and didn't always do his grazing like that, but as they've presented more and more diverse diets to those livestock, to those cattle in this particular case, they've seen their sickness go down to almost nothing. He very seldom ever treats an animal. They do well when they have those options. They self-medicate. If they get a little bit sick, or you know, they're feeling something coming on, those cattle will go and find what plants they need to sort of medicate themselves. And Fred Provenza has proven to me, I don't know if everyone agrees with him, but I believe that he's on to something, that the livestock and even humans, we've messed ours up quite a bit by eating a lot of things that we've kind of, in the industrial world here, we've learned how to mask the taste of things, and we eat, you know, Doritos and Twinkies because they taste good, but probably not because they're healthy. I think Justin made a reference to that earlier. If we just ate Twinkies, that we probably wouldn't be very healthy. We might not live very long, but they might taste good while you're eating them, at least for a little while. If you're still on a steady diet and nothing but that, you'd get tired of it, I bet. I would. And so he has put together all these different studies over the years, and pretty well proven to my satisfaction that the animals will in fact self-medicate and not eat too much of one thing or another. And he's proven that with poisonous plants, that they can eat, you know, some of the plants that we think of as poisonous plants, and we're privileged enough here in this part of the world to have very few that are that poisonous, that they actually kill our livestock very, very often. Very occasionally we might see it happen, but some areas have more prevalence for that. But some of those plants, they can eat some of it and actually do just fine. And some of those plants, they can eat more of it if they mix it with a different one, and they still do fine. But if you take an animal that's naive to that situation and doesn't know it, and they put them in there, tastes good, they go eat too much of it and it kills them, graveyard dead that day. they're done. So there's some things that happen there, and it's even a culture within the livestock. Us people have cultures. I've got one. My wife thinks I'm kind of picky about what I eat. Probably true. I won't really argue with it too much. But if you dump me out in Beijing, China tomorrow, I might have trouble finding much there I really think is all that good. The pig eye soup or whatever they've got might not look very appetizing. And so that's just an example of people have got culture, and the animals do too. Another thing that they've found, and Kathy Vogt has, I think she was a student of Fred Provenza, and she's spent a lot of time working with these animals as well. She's learned you can teach these animals to eat other things. She's got a whole protocol on how to do that if you get to where you want to. Teach your animal to eat some weed. First, you might want to make sure that weed isn't too poisonous, so that you don't teach them to eat something that kills them. But a lot of these weeds, so-called weeds, are quite nutritious, and you can teach those animals to start eating them with some different protocols that she's worked with. And also some of our grazing techniques may promote that to some degree as well. When we put our animals in there at higher densities, for example, and then there's sort of a competition on, if you don't eat it, I'm going to eat it first. And they start eating some things that they normally wouldn't have, and through that process sometimes they can learn that, hey, some of these other plants are good. And a lot of times they say also, once they learn to try new things, that they will try more new things and get even more diverse palates. I heard a stat from Fred on a podcast there the other day I was listening to, and he says that when you offer a diverse forages out here that these livestock can eat, and I think he was probably talking about cattle specifically in that statement, but it probably would apply to any species. He said the grasses, they're such and such quality of protein, and he said you've got all these forbs out here, which oftentimes forbs are higher proteins than the grasses are. Some of them are very high, especially at different times. And he said that the animals will typically eat a diet that is 2 to 3% higher protein if they have those forbs available out there for them than they will if they're just eating the grasses alone. So I think that was a great illustration of those forbs are important even as a forage. I think Justin was referencing some stuff earlier on some rangeland protocols from back in the 20s or 30s, and some of that may not have changed a whole lot on how we could kill these forbs and weeds. I think a lot of those forbs and weeds have more value than what us cattlemen have given them in the past. And so hopefully we're getting back down there on that curve he showed where earlier we thought we knew a whole lot. Hopefully we're getting get back down there in the trough where we really ought to be, and we realize we don't know so much, and maybe we don't need to kill all those forbs out of our pastures and our swards of grasslands. I was watching a heifer here, I don't know, maybe a month ago. I was moving some new pairs, had calving some heifers out, and anyway, I had come through a bunch of cedar trees, and I was on my horse, and I popped out there in the open, and there was a heifer out there grazing, and I'm kind of walking up to her, and I stopped though because I was watching her. There was a bunch of buckbrush there about yay tall, and she stopped, and she was just eating that buckbrush like it was candy. And then after a moment, she went down and she went to eating something else. And then I went on to driving the heifers like I was trying to do, but I took the time to stop and watch that, and we normally don't think of buckbrush as being very palatable.
Is that heifer for sale?
She could be. How much are you offering? She's got a calf on her now. You'd be 2 for 1. So that buckbrush apparently had something in it that heifer saw as pretty valuable at that time, that day. Now, had it been 2 weeks later, things may have changed totally, and she may not have had a bit of interest in that buckbrush. something else with that particular plant, has red berries on it in the fall and winter. At least it does if the weather hits it right. It usually is a pretty reliable producer in this part of the world. And the deer eat it all winter long. You see it I've got a lot of it on a lease pasture I've got over here to the north about a mile. And you can kind of see that the amount of red berries keeps diminishing over winter, and that's, if you watch the deer, you'll see the deer out there eating them. So I've seen the cattle eat them too. When I was managing some cattle for Hamilton's a few years back, we had pasture right on the north edge of Houston, and tons of buckbrush in there. Maybe a sign that we've done something bad to that pasture in the past would probably be what that is. But anyway, there was a lot of buckbrush out there. We got about a 4 or 5 inch snow there one day. They cleaned up the buckbrush berries the next day. They were gone. So apparently when the snow had kind of covered the grass a little bit, and it wasn't that much snow, they could still graze through it, and they were grazing through it. But somehow that changed the way those cattle looked at those buckbrush berries, because they ate them the next day. And I'm sure they probably benefited them quite well. And then something else here with Fred, he has gotten into the human health side of this more and studied that up in the last few years. And he is finding, and I think he's wrote a paper on this, you can probably, it's on the internet, free for all of us to look at. I didn't read the thing yet, but I know it's out there. And he says when our animals are eating a diverse palate, lots of different things are in their diet, that the quality of the meat, or if it's dairy, whatever products we're getting from them, is higher. And they're eating all these secondary compounds that are in there, it changes the quality of the meat. It comes through as a different nutrient density. He could use a lot bigger words than I will. Kind of getting in over my head if I want to get very deep on this subject, but let's just go with it to say that he's finding that when they are eating those diverse different menus of things, then the quality of the meat and milk that we get from them is higher quality and more healthy for the people that are eating it. Probably for any other animal that was eating it too. I guess if it was a buzzard, maybe they'd live longer too. But certainly as people, we're usually not that worried about how long the buzzards live.
In the video description, there are links to other talks from this field day. Justin Thomas shares his thoughts about how nature works. Elizabeth talks about how a diversity of plants above ground makes for a productive grassland, as well as biochar's contribution to organic matter. Amy Hamilton looks below ground and speaks about how a diversity of root systems makes for a grassland that is stronger than a monoculture. And Colt Hamilton speaks about establishing a diverse native silvo pasture or savanna.